ISIS takes over another major city in Iraq. Iraqi forces melt away, and the Obama administration calls it a bump in a long road. This is Special Report. Good evening, I'm Brett Baer, coming to you tonight from New York. ISIS has taken control of Ramadi. The terror group seized the key Iraqi city over the weekend, killing hundreds of people and sending thousands fleeing from that city. White House and Pentagon officials said today the defeat was a setback. They also said the U.S.-led airstrikes against ISIS will continue until that city is taken back. We have Fox team coverage tonight. Chief political correspondent Carl Cameron will look at how Iraq has become a hot-button issue on the presidential campaign trail. Senior political analyst Britt Hume with how history proves Iraq will remain part of the nation's conscience for some time. But first, correspondent Kevin Cork with the Obama administration trying to downplay the siege in Ramadi. Good evening, Kevin.
Brett, good evening to you. Even as the White House attempts to diminish claims that ISIS is in control of Ramadi, there is growing concern here tonight that Iraqi security forces aren't holding their own. It was a devastating scene as tens of thousands of Iraqis were forced to flee Ramadi after ISIS fighters seized control of the city. The collapse spawning a humanitarian crisis and threatening to unravel the Obama doctrine in the region. Witnesses said hundreds were killed as Iraqi security forces sped away, unable or unwilling to fight. At one point, a Defense Department official telling Fox News the fight for Ramadi was pretty much over for now. Clashes have raged in the beleaguered capital of Anbar province for months, but with 32 U.S. airstrikes there in the last 3 weeks, including 8 over the past 24 hours, White House officials say the battle is far from over. At the Pentagon, Colonel Steve Warren agreed, saying, quote, "To read too much into this is a mistake. This is one fight, one episode, and an instance where the Iraqi security force was not able to prevail today." Meanwhile, in Korea, Secretary of State John Kerry downplayed the carnage in Ramadi, saying the, quote, setback wouldn't last.
It is possible to have the kind of attack we've seen in Ramadi, but I am absolutely confident in the days ahead that will be reversed.
Despite U.S. involvement, the latest trouble in Ramadi is a blow to the president's strategy to train Iraqi forces, then have them take back ground from ISIS in the very area where thousands of U.S. forces gave their lives during the Iraq War.
This has been a contested area for a year and a half. It's a setback, but I don't have further analysis of the developments on the ground in the last couple of days.
Ramadi is also the backdrop of a centuries-long sectarian battle between Sunni and Shia Muslims, one that experts say threatens to engulf the entire Middle East. ISIS are Sunni, but radical enough to kill to impose their vision of strict Sharia law. Most of Iraq and neighboring Iran are Shia, and Tehran is armed Houthis in Yemen and militias in Iraq. Experts say that leaves the U.S. in the middle, fighting to save Iraq with help from Iran, a consistent source of disruption in the region.
I think this is a prescription for disaster. It will not reconcile the country together, both Sunni and Shia, and it's really playing out in Ramadi as we speak.
Brett, the Ramadi news comes after a weekend in which the U.S. announced that it had actually killed a top ISIS official in a raid in Syria. He was an accountant, the money man behind the operation. I should also point out during that raid, they captured his wife.
Kevin Cork live on the North Lawn. Kevin, thank you. Questions about Iraq, past and present, loom large following this weekend's ISIS takeover of Ramadi, and after former Florida Governor Jeb Bush stumbled over the Iraq invasion question several times last week. Tonight, Chief Political Correspondent Carl Cameron with how Republican candidates are handling the Iraq question.
With questions about the past in Iraq and the future worldwide consuming the 2016 debate, New Jersey Governor Chris Christie in New Hampshire said it's time to rebuild the U.S. military and its role in the world.
When the world faces its darkest moments, we use our strength and resolve to light a fire. When a threat appears from over the horizon, our country gets ready. Not when that threat arrives on our doorstep, or when it's popular in public opinion polls.
Polls show most Americans oppose the government's mass collection of electronic communications data without a warrant. But Christie, a former U.S. attorney, said voters should trust Washington.
Let's be clear. All these fears are exaggerated and ridiculous. When it comes to fighting terrorism, our government is not the enemy. And we should not be listening to people like Edward Snowden, who is a criminal.
On the other end of the GOP spectrum, Rand Paul promised to do whatever it takes, including a filibuster, to prevent Congress from reauthorizing the Patriot Act, which allowed the warrantless surveillance. He challenged those defending the Iraq invasion to defend its consequences.
I think when Hussein was toppled, we got chaos. We still have chaos in Iraq. I think it emboldened Iran. I think we now have the rise of radical Islam in Iraq as well.
GOP hawks call Paul an isolationist, particularly South Carolina Senator Lindsey Graham, who will officially join the race 2 weeks from today, and has told insiders that blocking Paul's candidacy is a big motivation.
I will make an announcement on June 1st. I'm running because I think the world is falling apart. I've been more right than wrong on foreign policy.
Former Florida Governor Jeb Bush admitted over the weekend that his evolving answers were a misstep on the Iraq war question. Knowing what we know now, would you have done things differently?
We're all going to make mistakes. If you're looking for a perfect candidate, he probably existed 2,000 years ago.
Questioned on Fox News Sunday, Marco Rubio, a Bush protege turned rival, put it this way.
It was not a mistake for the president to go into Iraq based on the information he was provided as president. Today, we know if the president had known that there were no weapons of mass destruction at the time, you still would have had to deal with Saddam Hussein, but the process would have been different. I doubt very seriously that the president would have gotten, for example, congressional approval.
As long as American service members are in harm's way over in that region, the question's probably not going to go away. Louisiana Governor Bobby Jindal formed an exploratory committee today and plans to get in the race in the last week of June. There are at least 5 more candidates, including Bush, Scott Walker, and John Kasich, all planning to formally announce their candidacies before the middle of July. Brett.
Field's getting bigger. Carl, thank you. Iraq remains a hot-button issue more than a decade after the U.S. invaded that country. Senior political analyst Britt Hume joins us now from Washington with lessons learned from the past and how they may play out even beyond 2016. Good evening, Britt.
Good evening to you, Brett. The fall of Ramadi to ISIS and the sight of Republican candidates wrestling with hypothetical scenarios from 12 years ago are clear reminders that Iraq is very much with us and likely will be for some time. It now occupies a place in the national consciousness similar to that once held by Vietnam. That unsuccessful conflict soured this nation on the use of its military for nearly 2 decades. George H.W. Bush thought he'd overcome Vietnam Syndrome, as it was called, with the successful and swift completion of the first Gulf War. This, of course, roughly coincided with the collapse of the Soviet Union in the face of a long and patient display by the U.S. and its allies of a strategy of peace through strength. Put simply, it meant diplomacy backed by the threat of force. Its effectiveness depends on 2 things: an unmatched military with a long reach and the willingness when all else fails to use it. There can be no threats made and not carried out, no hard-won victories undone by hasty withdrawals, no announcement to enemies of what you won't do. Above all, there can be no fantasies about turning dangerous enemies into strategic partners by giving in to their demands. Politically, Vietnam and now Iraq have made American strength in the world hard to sustain. But what we are seeing in the world now is what happens when the U.S. cannot or will not lead. Brett?
Well, Brett, what about this weekend raid by Special Operations Forces that took out this senior ISIS commander, according to officials? I mean, it seems like they're doing something on that front.
Well, and a good example of the efficiency of the American military and the effectiveness of it. But you have to raise this question. We keep knocking off these terrorist leaders. And yet, in spite of that, we still see advances being made by terrorist organizations, especially ISIS. So we knocked off one of their leaders, but in the meantime, they captured Ramadi. So it would seem that you need to do what we did in the raid, but we need to do more as well.
Yeah, Britt, as always, thank you.
You bet.
Marines are investigating the hard landing of an MV-22 Osprey in Hawaii Sunday. The hard landing during a training exercise left 1 Marine dead and 21 injured at Bellows Air Force Station. A Marine spokesman said 1 Marine remains in critical condition and 3 others are still hospitalized. Up next, behind the scenes of 2016, Fox News gets an all-access pass to one presidential candidate's campaign. First, here's what some of our Fox affiliates around the country are covering tonight. Fox 29 in Philadelphia, where Amtrak trains are moving again. I took one today. 6 days after a train derailment, there left 8 people dead and more than 200 injured. A new speed control system is now in effect along the curve in the tracks where the derailment occurred as the investigation into the cause continues.